So we'll do introductions really quickly here. I'm Anna Heck. I'm an apiculture extension educator at Michigan State University. And then we'll do Zach, Megan, and Dan.
Zach Hua. I've been at Michigan State for 26 years, studying how stresses affect honeybees.
And I'm Megan Milbrath. I've been keeping bees basically my whole life and at MSU since 2012, and I'm half extension, half research. And most of my research is on honeybee pests and diseases. And most of my extension is with veterinarians and commercial beekeepers and queen rearing, and well, I guess all things right now.
I'm Dan Wines. I'm the farm manager at the Pollinator Center on campus in Lansing. Look after about 200 colonies to support the work that Megan, Zachary, Anna do as far as research, teaching, outreach, and we have some other users as well. Been in bees almost 20 years, and I've been with MSU since 2017, I guess, 8 years.
Great. Next slide, please. So this is an MSU extension program. We're open to everyone. Next slide, please. So we compiled a lot of resources for beekeeping in Michigan in July on this website. So if you look at the screen, the web address is there. You can use the QR code to pull up the web page. I also put the link in the chat, and if you're watching the recording, it'll be in the description box below. So if you're looking for links, you can start here. It has a lot of information that's relevant to beekeeping this time of year. Next slide, please. All right, so one announcement we wanted to share is that the survey responses or the results from the National Beekeeping Survey are available now, or at least the preliminary results are available. So earlier this year, we asked Michigan beekeepers to fill out the survey. We know it takes some time to fill it out, but it does help us to have more responses from each state, and we wanted to let you know that those preliminary results are available. So nationally, they saw about 55% of colonies lost from the survey year, which was April 1st, 2023 to April 1st, 2024. And there's more information on the Apiary Inspectors of America's website. Next slide, please. Also wanted to share, in case you're interested, Bee Culture publishes the American Bee Research Conference proceedings. You can see the presentation abstracts. Those are online, and so you can get a sense of different research and extension that's going on in the country nationally by reading these proceedings. All right, so we want to acknowledge some of the funding support we've received for our work. We received money from Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, from the EPA, and then also from U.S. Department of Agriculture to support our work, to provide education to beekeepers and to provide information to other people about pollinator protection. Next slide, please. All right, so we're about to jump into some Q&A, but if you have questions between webinars, the best way to ask them of our team is to send them through the Ask Extension form, which you can find on the pollinators.msu.edu website. Next slide, please. All right, so we are going to take some time tonight to answer your beekeeping questions. If you're watching live on Zoom, you'll see the Q&A box, and that's where you can type your question for us to respond to. While you're all thinking of your questions and typing them out, I was thinking that Dan, Megan, and Zach, you can maybe give a little bit of an update in terms of what you're seeing, what you're doing to manage bees right now, or what you're seeing in bloom. So who wants to start us off?
Okay, you want me to go first?
Sure, thanks, Zach.
So I think basswood is largely down. I think this year has been a good year for both black locust and also basswood, and several different species of basswood in Michigan. The small leaf linden was down, but largely for us, probably done. But the silver basswood, Tilia tomentosa, is probably still ongoing. I saw a lot of white sweet clovers blooming by the roadside. think Staghorn sumac is also done free shot. So now mostly really just the white Dutch clover and white sweet clover also. Of course, yellow sweet clover would bloom about the same time. But I usually see more white sweet clover than yellow ones. So those are the two clovers going on. The red clover is also blooming. I did not go see whether outside clover is blooming or not. Probably because they will usually bloom same time strawberries are being harvested. So I'll be guessing outside is also blooming. But they're very similar to white clover, except they're pinkish and smaller than the red clover, same size as white clover. It's very hard to tell, but they're mostly running horizontally through rhizome, whereas white clover mostly through seeds. So in terms of research, we have been moving bee colonies to see how that impact production. And we always see a loss of production for about one day. So if you're trying to move your colonies, do not move it during a huge honey flow like black locust or basswood flow, because you'll lose a good day. And on a very good day, we probably gain 5 to 8 kilos. That's nectar per day. So that's about, you need to divide by 2 for the amount of honey. So basically you're losing 8 pounds of honey if you move it the wrong time of the year. So
Thanks, Zach. All right, Megan and Dan, you want to jump in next about what you're doing with bees this time of year, what you've seen maybe over the last month?
Yeah, well, I won't speak for Dan, but he and I had a conversation about what we did for beekeeping this last month. And the last time I was, he's laughing, but I think we're technically correct. So the last time I was in my hive was basically a month ago. And this is the time of year that, well, or last month, and depending where you are in the state, it could be basically right now that we're not going in that much. So I had set up all of my colonies where everyone, I did checkbacks for my splits right around Memorial Day, and I did my first miticide treatment. So I used VarroxSan on anything that was small or still requeening, and formic acid on anything that was like big and totally fine. And then I gave everybody 2 supers. And then I went back out and checked everybody who had gotten the formic acid and made sure that they had enough space, that they were green right, and I gave them VarroxSan and then made sure they had enough supers. And then really my job was to leave them alone to make honey. And then just because I can't be reasonable and just take some time off, I decided to start raising queen cells so that I can make splits. So I have been grafting so that I can make some splits. And what I'm doing now is just taking nukes out of some hives and just so that I have little increases for next year. And then I'm also taking, like, I'm going to start honey pretty soon. And all of the hives that are not actively making honey, I'm going to take off whatever they have and break them down into nukes. So I am making a lot of increases at this time of year as well. So I literally have been selling queen cells from my driveway until 2 minutes before this seminar, and my dear husband is dealing with the last customer who is coming, I think, right now. And so it is, for me, it's queen cells and expansion season as well.
Great. Dan?
Yeah. So yeah, as Megan mentioned, with I've been pretty hands off with our bees this last month, but I've been working getting honey extraction equipment set up and kind of going through the honey house and making sure everything works and starting to clean and sterilize that, anticipating harvesting later this week. So that's the kind of the personal bees on campus. A little different timing since our last webinar. Everything got a varroa mite treatment in early June. It was a mix. Most of them got formic acid, Formic Pro. Some of them got VarroxSan. And that was kind of similar to Megan's thoughts on, smaller ones or ones with brood breaks. I put VarroxSan in those. And the other kind of the more mature colonies or ones that hadn't had a brood break, been split, put Formic Pro in at this early part of June. And then the last week of June, about 10 days ago or so, I guess it is now, I harvested honey from quite a few colonies. Those that were, kind of the overwintered colonies and mature colonies that were producing. I took the early honey off. Um, Extracted that because with this hot weather, I'm a little short on equipment, relative short on supers relative to the number of hives. So I wanted to get those supers off, extracted, and get them back out on. And if we can get them filled twice, that'd be great. But just giving the bees that space so we don't get in any crowding, swarming type of issue. Our early season honey was really light, kind of a nice champagne color. As that kind of mentioned the floral sources. What I harvested in late June is kind of what the bees collected in late May and early June, and it was a really good black locust flow this year from everything I observed, both on the landscape and in the colonies. I think since that harvest, the Zach mentioned the basswood, both the small leaf and large leaf and silver leaf, those are kind of wrapped up. I think they bloomed fairly quickly with the kind of the heat this year. But just cracking lids on hives today, and I think they certainly gained weight on that. So I'm looking at probably another round of harvesting honey sort of late this week or into the following week. Of course, it's going to be at least in this part of Michigan, a very much watch the forecast and watch the weather. We kind of have one stable day tomorrow, and then it's a lot of unsettled weather. So like beekeeping, it's we'll make a plan and then let the weather and the bees tell us, dial in the timing of that. So that's kind of what's the recent past and near future. And then I will also be looking at, getting another round of mite treatment on in the next couple of weeks. Probably formic in a lot of them. And that's going to be looking at a temperature window when we're, in the topping out no more than the low 80s. So I start, keeping a pretty close eye on the forecast in anticipation of doing that if there's a window coming up here. So that's kind of my plan.
Thanks. And it looks like we have a lot of questions coming in through the Q&A. So keep them coming. Megan, I'll let you start moderating and asking us all the questions or answering whichever questions you want to take.
Well, I'll take the first one. So there's a couple people that had the same one as Dan and I were talking about what is VarroxSan. So I'm going to put a link to the company page in the chat. But it is a new miticide that was released last August, I believe. So it was kind of available at the end of last year. So like I said, we're all using it. I'm feeling very optimistic about it. It's an extended release oxalic acid. So I think many of you have heard about like some homemade versions of this, but this is actually a legal labeled, very well controlled version that you can put in your hive. The reason that I am optimistic about it, well, the reason that I like it is that it is a 42 to 56 day treatment. So you put it in the hive and then you do not have to go in to do a mite treatment for at least 2 months, or about 2 months. It can be used when honey supers are on, which is why we're using it now. So it is designed to be used when brood is in the hive. They recommend using 1 strip per every 2.5 frames. So you can see it comes in 60 strip or 10 strip packages. But a lot of times, like I did reach out to the company and I have an email from them stating that if you use double deeps, and like most people have 9 frames in 10 frame boxes, so their brood nest is 18 frames, you would use a max of 6 strips per hive. So the way that I put them in was 3 on the top and 3 on the bottom, right in the brood nest. But their label has all the good instructions. We did a trial of it in 2023 on just a few hives, on 10 hives, and had very good results with that. They're not published. We're working on writing that up, but I have spoken about them, and I had enough of a positive experience to try it out again. But that's all that I have data on. I'm in the middle of a 240 hive trial where VarroxSan is being very heavily tested this summer. So we hopefully will have a lot more results, but it's a nice option for something that you can put in the colony during the honey flow when you've got brood in your hives. Dan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that pretty well covered it. The only thing I would say is I have, because it's a new product, and I say my initial impressions are very positive. As Megan mentioned, we kind of have, trialed it a couple years ago, and it seems to be good. I just the recommendation, as with anything new, in you're using as a beekeeper, you want to get familiar with it. I'm a big fan of like not all the eggs in one basket, especially with something I don't have a lot of familiarity with. Um, so both in personal bees and campus bees, I would say it's gone in 25% of the hives. I'm not going to wholly commit to something that I don't have the firsthand experience with. While I believe it works and I think it will become part of the, a relied upon mite management, kind of one of the things in the toolbox. I want to get myself better understanding of how it works, kind of the fine tuning of, just that firsthand knowledge of, yep, I've, talked to a lot of people, gets good reviews. I just want to verify it myself before I kind of commit the whole operation to it, because if I find out it didn't work like I thought it was going to, then I've got a real big problem, and that can be lead to a bad year. So
And I do, yeah, that's a very good point. And that's why I said, like, I'm optimistic, but we don't have a ton of data yet. And also just to put it out there, there were 3 new products that were just recently approved at the federal level. So they're still working on all the state approvals and becoming available. But even for next year, we should have more options that we can use as well. All right, Anna, I'm going to give you the first one. The question says, I have 3 new hives. Yay. And it's going on 2 months, and it's still not ready for the second deep. Is this normal? And I would also add, what could they be doing?
So a lot of times, especially like in Michigan, when you have a new colony that starts this early in the season, it'll draw a lot of comb, and you would expect that it would have drawn its second box by now. So if you're using deep equipment, you would have expected that it would have filled out that second box by now. One thing you can be doing is feeding sugar syrup. So sometimes that can help give the bees the nutrition they need in order to produce wax. Another thing you want to be checking on is queen issues. So sometimes if a colony has a queen issue, like you accidentally squish it or it swarms, that can really slow down the population growth of the colony. And you also just kind of also want to keep an eye on diseases, right? So if it's a sick colony, that can also slow its buildup. This time of year, bees really slow down on making wax comb. So if all your new colonies started with foundation and you don't have drawn comb from previous years, um, bees will bees can still draw, but you might notice that they draw comb much more slowly than they did earlier in the spring. So I would just kind of keep an eye on them, make sure that they're healthy, queen right, and getting plenty of nutrition. You can overwinter colonies in a single deep if you need to, but yeah, keep an eye on it. The other thing you'll want to think about is, later in the fall, organizing the frames so that they're in a nice configuration for winter. So if you have a single deep that's drawn and then the top deep is only partly drawn, that's hard sometimes for bees to cluster on. So you'll want to rearrange it so that they have a lot of honey frames next to each other in the top box for winter.
That is great. All right, Dan. Has there been any research about the pros and cons, or you can give your opinion, I think, too, on keeping the exterior insulation on the hives during the summer If you have a vented bottom and top board, what is your opinion on the subject?
So this is not something I have dabbled with too much as far as insulating hives in even in the winter. The most I've done, I had some extra rigid foam and I put that on top, inch and a half of foam. Um, so I don't have a great depth of experience to draw from on this. I know some certainly do favor insulation on top with a little, we have these high temperatures, sun beating down. Is it radiating through the lid, causing the bees to have to, dissipate that heat? So I could see some benefit in some top insulation. As far as screen bottom boards, it's not something I've really utilized here in Michigan. We get these warm temperatures like it's been the last couple of weeks into the 90s and humid. You see bees bearding out, ventilating, probably sending a few more foragers for water to help cool the hive down. But I don't have a great deal of experience with insulation during the summer.
And I'll just add, if you're interested in a talk about insulation in the winter, Bill Hesbeck, who's done a lot of presentations and writing on this topic, is going to be presenting at the Michigan Beekeepers Association's fall conference this October.
Excellent plug and very true. And he does care a lot about insulation. I don't know of any research of it in the summer. I do know that there are some older studies that look at it during spring buildup, and insulation does tend to slow down spring buildup in colonies, but I think it all kind of evens itself out over time. All right, Zachary, I have a question for you. It says, do we in Michigan get a dearth like in other states?
Yes, definitely. It's coming up. The earth in Michigan is usually somewhere after, I would say after August 15th until basically until November. So when you see bees start robbing, when you have a bee truck with a few drops of honey on the bed, and after 5 minutes you have 10,000 bees flying over, and you know that's a death period because bees are just looking for things sweet. Like right now, if you have a truck with some honey, the bees are not going to pay attention because there's enough food from the flowers. So they're not going to rob. Usually they don't start robbing sometime. Earlier years would be end of July, but usually definitely around August 15th, August 25th, then they will start their behavior, robbing. And so that's the death period, the bees will come for anything. And it's very difficult to work with bees if you have bees robbing in 5 minutes. I used to have robbing screens, a square, so we could do research still with bees, put around a colony, so you can take brood frames out and bees will be bouncing on the screen. It's open on the top, but usually they go for the smell and won't be able to find. Eventually they'll find if you open, the colony is open for half an hour, but usually most manipulations are done 10, 15 minutes, you'll be okay. So, yeah. But if you have a
And
lucky year, rain is good, maybe the death period is not as obvious.
so I personally have a follow-up question for that, and I have one initial response, but I think for the, what would be some plants that we could plant for late summer blooming that would work in most of Michigan if we wanted to work on the dearth parts in our areas?
Uh,
Well,
BB
I'll
tree,
start. Oh, go ahead if you have one.
BB tree might be a little bit early, but sometimes they bloom late. They bloom as male flowers first for 2 weeks, and they stop for about a week or two, and come up as female flowers. So on the year that's late, they could be the female flowers could be August, so it'll be near the death period. Another one's wind sumac. That's usually late blooming. Yeah. Couldn't think of anything else.
I'm gonna put in well, one thing that we've done at the Pollinator Center a few years is do a really late planting of buckwheat. So you can plant buckwheat even now where we are and in a lot of places, and that works well.
So that you're actually controlling the blooming time,
Mhm.
never in the transplanting time, seeding time. Yeah.
And then I'm going to put in sneezeweed, which is poorly named. It does not make you sneeze. But it's a really late blooming one that is a nice wetland plant that I've really, really fallen for the last few years.
Yeah.
And then obviously asters and goldenrods are usually pretty late.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot the dog beans blooming right now.
Oh yeah, dogbane.
A good bee plant. It smells so good. The flowers.
Yeah. And the milkweeds are all the kind of stuff that's related. All the milkweeds, all the Asclepias are going right now where we are.
Yeah.
All right, so there's a question that I'm going to guess is going to be mainly for me that came in over email. And it said, I'd be interested in how to utilize EFB colonies when symptoms have cleared, either through watchful waiting, antibiotic treatment, or whatever means. But especially in regards to post-antibiotic treatments, when symptoms disappear, you have to wait 6 weeks before you can harvest honey, and you don't want to split these hives or make new queens from them. So what do you do with them this time of year? Um, and as you know, they can go from very sick to honeybound in a short time after symptoms clear up. So European foulbrood disease, it has a very strong seasonality for early, like late May, early June is where we see the peak of it. That being said, I've seen it all the way into September and all the way as early as February in hives around the country. But that is really a big peak. And as mentioned, sometimes it does seem to just like immediately turn around. One thing about the antibiotics is it's not 6 weeks before you can harvest honey from a hive, it's 6 weeks before you can put honey supers on. So the withdrawal period is really, really long for oxytetracycline, which is the one antibiotic that's labeled for control of European foulbrood. So when we've used oxytetracycline on campus, one of the things that we've done, if the colony needs space, is just to give it deep boxes and then allow it to draw out some deeps or fill in some deeps. And then that way you're not worried about antibiotics ever getting into honey that would ever be used for human consumption. So one way to deal with colonies, if you are using antibiotics, if you don't have it on well before, so one option is you use it well before the honey flow. The other option is if you're using it during a honey flow, is that you're ensuring that those frames would never go into the flow that would lead to human consumption. So that would be one of the options. But in terms of not wanting to split those hives, that is a little different. So one of the main characteristics about European foulbrood is that it is very much a herd level disease. So when you see colonies that have signs or symptoms in them, the pathogen is likely in all hives in the yard. So when you have European foulbrood, your operation kind of has European foulbrood, and the disease pops up in different hives when conditions are right. And I don't know what the conditions are. We have spent a lot of work on that. Anna posted in the chat our link to the European foulbrood webinar. But some things that we have found out in our research is one is the pathogen is very, very prevalent in Michigan, like over 1 in 5 hives. It is very persistent on equipment. So once you have it in a hive, it's going to stay on the equipment. So even though it doesn't form a spore, it's there for a long time. But it's also really, really present. The bacteria is really present in colonies that look perfectly healthy. So a lot of times when people are concerned about disease, they don't want to do anything with the colonies that look sick, which is very important. But if you have European fall brood in one colony, like you have the bacteria in all the hives in the yard. So you do want to be careful about selling or things like that. But you, in terms of like just splitting it, you're not necessarily going to make it so that you're going to be increasing the number of hives with European fall brood. Like the good slash bad news is that they probably already have it. So it gives you more flexibility in working with it. Um, what we are looking into, so we mentioned antibiotics, what we are looking into a little bit now and a lot more next year is using a shook swarm to deal with EFB so that when you see it, you shake the bees onto new equipment and either dispose of the old equipment or put it into a yard that you know already has a disease so you can kind of clean up a whole yard. And I won't spend a ton of time on that tonight, but there are some options where you can try to work to eradicate it or clean out some yards. But once the colony looks healthy, you can kind of go ahead and make splits. Anna, what do you think about drone frames for the control of Varroa? And when is it too late in the year to use those frames?
Great. So I think that, if you're someone who's interested in using drone frames to help manage Varroa, I think that it's a great tool in the toolbox. From a lot of conversations with beekeepers, we wouldn't suggest doing that as your only strategy for managing varroa mites, but it might be something that can help. And so for those of you who aren't aware, there's a couple of ways to do it. One is you just buy a frame that has that large cell foundation, and then the colony draws that comb. The queen lays unfertilized eggs in those cells, and those develop into drones. And then after those cells are capped, the beekeeper removes that brood, and that's a way to remove all of the varroa mites that were reproducing in that drone brood. There's other ways to do it where you just give the bees some comb to draw out, and they often will draw bigger cells for drone brood, and you remove that. So I think it's a tool in the toolbox. I would monitor your varroa mites, and I would plan on having other varroa management strategies, but that might be one thing you can do to help keep mites low throughout the season. Later in the season, you might see that the colony is raising fewer drones, and then you also want to keep in mind that colonies are going to be slower to draw comb. So if you're trying to give that colony a frame of foundation to draw, or just kind of a top bar, that's going to be more slow moving on to this from now into the rest of the season. You should expect that either the colony won't draw comb, or if it does, it might be kind of slow. So normally when we think about drone brood removal, I think of it as ideally a spring management strategy, not so much in the summer, and especially not in the fall.
Excellent. Dan, I have a lot of old plasticell foundations in wooden frames. At some point, should I stop using them and discard them, or can they safely be cleaned for continued reuse in my hives? And I'm going to add, how would you reuse them? And you're muted.
So yeah, the Plasticell Foundation, you can reuse them. So I guess to back up, it is a good practice to kind of rotate out, particularly brood comb. It accumulates pathogens and chemicals and things like that in the wax. So it is a good idea to cycle that out periodically, and replace it. So that's possible if you have plastic foundation like Plasticell, or there's some others out there. I have found it fairly challenging to do that. I think you can scrape it back to the foundation, but that'll leave a lot of little irregularities and parts of pupal casings and things like that. If you're going to clean it up like that, you definitely want to apply like a fresh layer of wax over it, like melted wax, so you get back to that kind of clean template for the bees to work off of. If there's any, in my experience, irregularities, you just end up with the bees kind of take their own architectural journey, and you end up with a lot of drone comb and a lot of cross comb. Um, so I think rewaxing it is probably the best bet. It's not something, because of the type of plastic, it's not something you can use heat on, or the foundation sheets warp and twist and distort. So that's not really an option. Um, I've heard of some beekeepers kind of pressure washing, but I think that's kind of similar to the physically scraping the comb off back to the foundation, where you would still have to go through and re-wax it and make sure, you've kind of got that regular hexagon template as intended, rather than a lot of little irregularities that they're going to build comb in it's fine for them, but it's just not how we want. Kind of defeats the purpose of having, um, nice uniform brood frames.
All right. We are working on a product that might solve. We're working on some new foundations, but I can't say anything more about it. And don't push me because I'm terrible with an NDA. All right. So there is a question about how do you manage leftover bees and brood from mating nukes? And this one's specifically for me, so I'll answer it. I mean, if other people do it too, they can. When you finish up making nukes for the year. So yeah, definitely when you're raising queens and if you're setting up mating nukes, you kind of end up with lots of frames left over. And I have two different systems with it. The system that works the best is, so sometimes like the colonies are fine and I just keep the last group for myself and overwinter a bunch of nukes. So at some point I just stop selling the queens out of the mating nukes and I just say this last batch is for me and I overwinter the nukes, as long as they have enough food. Usually when they're pretty small mating nukes and I've used them for mating nukes, they don't have a lot of food. And in order to do that, I have to steal honey, like capped frames from other hives. Um, so that's kind of the more labor intensive version, but you end up with the most bees. The easiest version is I just have one hive that I lovingly call the dump hive. And I just, every time there's a colony that like didn't requeen or is laying workers, or I don't want to use that nuke again because it ran out of brood, or I've sold the queen out of it and I don't want to redo it again, I just put it on the dump hive. And it gets quite tall and then eventually, not everything's filled and I can put stuff above an inner cover for it to get robbed out and bring it back down. But there's kind of like one hive that just gets all the extra bits and pieces. And usually that hive just does totally fine. You just take a strong hive and just kind of put them on top of it. Again, so just for full disclosure though, the scale that I'm doing queens at is I think I have a dozen mating nukes right now. So I am very, very, very small potatoes. I sold 30 queen cells today. So for me, that's something that I can do for very, very small scale is just kind of either if they're good nukes, combining them all to making, a couple really strong nukes as long as the queen's right. And if there's problems with it, I just kind of put the frames onto other boxes. All right. Anna, I'll have you start with this one. In general, are you treating with Superzon? And what is your perspective on the Varroa resistance to Amitraz and its impact on colony collapse?
Great. So in general, yes, we are using veromite treatments with honey supers on. So when we're collecting honey for human consumption, and that's mainly because here in Michigan, we have honey supers on a lot of the year. We're a pretty good honey production state, and that means that a lot of times we have honey supers on for several months at a time when the veromite populations are building up. And our goal is to keep the veromite levels low throughout the beekeeping season from spring through fall. And so in order to manage mites, a lot of times we're looking at treatments that can be used that are labeled for use with honey supers. So those include formic acid treatments and oxalic acid treatments and hops-beta acid treatments. So Formic Pro, Formic Pro, Mitaway Quick Strips, all the oxalic acid treatments, and then HopGuard. And then our perspective on Varroa resistance to Amitraz and its impact on colony collapse. So in my colonies and at MSU, we haven't used a lot of Amitraz, so I don't have a lot of firsthand experience. We do talk a lot and listen to presentations by some of the USDA researchers who are looking at Amitraz resistance, and Megan can speak more to this, but basically we know that there are Varroa mites in colonies that are resistant to Amitraz, and with some of the high colony losses we saw this year among commercial colonies, that is one of the things that they looked at was resistance, and they were finding resistance. The number of mites in colonies they were testing was overall kind of small, but they were finding resistance to Amitraz. Megan, is there anything you want to talk about there? You're muted, Megan.
I muted myself twice. So that is the thing that I think a lot of people are saying or seems to be the likely candidate. So they are still running the chemical, like the pesticide tests from all the USDA response, but Amitraz resistance does seem to be the front runner. I mentioned the large field trial that we're running, and part of it is testing different miticides, but the main goal is to look at Amitraz resistance. So we've got these 240 colonies that are all getting different treatments. And then we are doing both the genetic testing on all the mites that come out of them. And so some of them are just getting Amitraz. So Amitraz in the spring, nothing in the summer, Amitraz in the fall. And we're comparing that to other treatments. And we are looking at both the genomic analysis for the resistance. And then we'll also do the actual testing where we take the mites and see the number in the field that are resistant to Amitraz. But that does seem to be the likely candidate. And even, a half hour before this call started, I talked to a beekeeper who had pretty good success using just Apivar every year. And then this last year, he lost all but one of his colonies. So he's a hobby beekeeper, but lost all but one of his colonies. And it does make sense. The levels of Amitraz resistance are quite high. There is a follow-up that is there any concern that Varroa may become resistant to oxalic acid? And I'll start with that, and then maybe if someone else wants to add to it. But anything, like in theory, anything can be resistant to anything. Eventually, with enough pressure, it is much less likely that the mites will develop resistance to the acid-based treatments, we think, because we think that the mode of action is more of a physical than just a straight pesticide. So when something develops resistance to a chemical, a lot of times it's just a genetic change that allows the bees to detoxify something and like get it out of the body more quickly. And they have, bees and mites and humans, everybody has a lot of different pathways that you can get rid of a lot of chemicals. And so you can kind of pick up one of those pathways or change to have one of those pathways to get rid of a chemical. With the acids, we think that it's physical damage that's probably harming the mites. And it's a lot harder for a mite to pick up a genetic mutation or something like that would allow it to evade physical damage, because they'd have to basically like recreate their bodies. So again, resistance to anything is possible, and our recommendation is always to use a variety of different management strategies, including non-chemical treatments like splits and the drone brood removal and things like that. But it is much less likely that we'll be seeing it with the oxalic. We do have some lovely suggestions. So Eileen mentioned for fall planting is the Pycnanthemum, and she recommended the Pycnanthemum, the muticum, which is I think the clustered mountain mint. But all of the mountain mints are also very lovely. And I know we have a bunch of these by the hives in the children's garden, and it's beautiful and filled with bees. So if people want to put in the chat or the Q&A more planting recommendations, I will make sure that those go out because that is a good one. There was also another recommendation talking about the drone brood, about using like a medium frame in the deeps instead of the green frame. And that's a really easy way to remove the drones. All right. Oops. Let's see. Anna, I'm going to have you do another miticide one. What is the fewest number of deep brood frames would you use Formic Pro on? And if so, or I guess when would you use 2 pads or 1 pad and then the second pad?
So we can put the Formic Pro labels in the chat, but the most recent one says that you need to have at least 6 deep frames covered in bees in order to use the Formic Pro treatment. So small colonies do not handle formic, or colonies that are small or weakened population do not handle formic acid treatments well. You want to have at least 6 frames of bees, but when we're thinking about that, we're thinking of frames that are covered with bees. So normally I don't use them at the formic acid treatments unless, it's closer to a full deep's worth of bees. If you're using mediums, then, you can figure out the rough equivalent of that. So that's for formic acid. So, just following the label, but it should be at least 6 frames of bees. And then I'm trying to find that one. What was the second part of that question?
Oh, the 2 pads at a time versus the
Oh,
one followed by the other one.
yeah, so that's just those are both options available to you. It doesn't really seem to make a big difference in terms of like what the colony that's receiving the treatment. It's a your preference as a beekeeper for how you want to apply the treatment. Personally, I'm a fan of just doing 2 strips at once because it means that I don't have to come back another time to do a treatment. So you're either doing 2 strips at once or you're doing 1 strip followed by another strip several days later. The issue I worry about with the 1 strip and then following up several days later with the other strip is that you might not have the right weather conditions or temperature conditions for that treatment. In which case the label does say you can delay it. But because here in Michigan we often don't always have temperatures that are within the range of 50 to 85 for treating with formic. I like once I have that window to just do 2 strips at once versus the other treatment. So. But those are both available to you, and I think either one is an option. So either 2 strips at once or 1 strip followed by the other ones at 10 days later.
Mhm. And I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted now. There's very exciting news from the yard where my Promethean silk moths are emerging and making. So last year I had 3 of them on that came in onto my tulip poplar that I got from the honey tree nursery. And so I had 3 that overwintered and they were all females that emerged. And then last year I had 11 cocoons and they are actually emerging right now and mating. We've got both versions. So but yeah, if you Google Promethean silk moths, they're quite gorgeous. And they just showed up when I planted a tulip poplar. So that's a plug for planting tulip poplars. Zachary, there's the question that says, can I take a frame with a queen cell and put it in a deep to start a new hive?
Warframe?
I think, yeah, they said a frame with a queen cell and put it in a deep to start a new hive. So maybe I think you picked up on something there. How would you do it?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. You mean the deep already has other bees, or is that totally empty?
Let's say it has bees and a queen cell.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's doable. It's cells are usually easily accepted in a foreign colony. The trick is to how do you prevent maybe some kind of fighting between that frame of bees and then the presumably old bees from the other hive which is queenless. What I would do is to put, assume that deep frame has 5 or 6 frames of bees. I would just put this frame with a queen cell on the edge and put 2 or 3 empty frames buffering the other bees. So that's one way. Another way is to shake very lightly because you have a queen cell. Probably you don't want to do it. But if you're really experienced, you could brush the bees off to the front of the hive so those bees, the old bees are going to go back to the other source hive, and only the bees that are very young, basically 5 days and younger, is going into the new hive. And then you have this frame with a queen cell into that new colony. Then there's no, you just don't want to have fighting between those bees and have that fighting carry over to the destroyment of the queen cell, I guess, which probably should happen if they're already queenless for at least 24 hours. That would be readily accept the queen cell. But to be safe, that's what I would do. Assume there are some bees in that hive, other than using a newspaper, which is not easy to do just with one frame. And you have to separate, which a lot of work to separate one frame with others. So or you could just spray some light syrup on that frame, and some old bees, and then just put that one frame in. Usually that'll be fine. Unless you do it in the dearth period, like in September, sometimes you get bees killed. Because in the dearth period, bees are the nest mate recognition is stronger because they're trying to be on alert to see, they don't want to have parasitic bees coming to steal the honey. So they're actually more fighting. But if there's a big honey flow, they're more acceptable to other bees. There's actually studies showing that when bees go into the wrong hive, they can bribe the god bees and get accepted. Whereas during the dearth period, there's more. You will see that in late September and October in Michigan. You see bees are fighting because some bees are trying to steal honey from another hive, and they get stopped by the god bees, and they'll be fighting on the entrance. So that's what's happening. So as long as you're not doing that late, you should be fine.
And the person did follow up and said it was a frame with bees and a queen cell. When at this time of year where I am in Jackson County, the smallest nukes that I'm making are basically 2 frames of brood with a queen cell, a frame of food, so like 3 frames covered with bees. And that's the very smallest. There is a question, which is kind of the other end, that says, can I split an overcrowded hive and make a new hive instead of making a nuke? You absolutely can. So I like when I say that I'm using and making nukes, really what I'm saying is I'm making hives that aren't for honey production. So a lot of them are going to go into single deeps, just because that's the equipment that I have rather than specific nuke boxes. Some of them aren't going into other nuke boxes, but it can be, it's just a regular split. However, at this time of year, if you're thinking about overcrowded, I have hives right now that are taller than I am, because they're making honey and they've got many supers on. I mean, I just added 2 new boxes, but I had to put them up really high. So I've got colonies that have multiple supers of honey, and for me, that's a positive thing because I want the honey out of them. So, like in the springtime, we definitely make splits for crowded to prevent swarming. In the summer, you don't necessarily have to split. You can put lots of supers on, but if you want to split for an increase, you can make the increase, but you will lose out on the honey production. So for me, I'm splitting the ones that aren't necessarily overcrowded. I'm splitting the ones that aren't doing anything. But you could absolutely make a split at this time of year, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that you would need to do for crowded. There is another question that says, what is Megan's favorite way to produce queen cells? I'm not going to give you the entire queen cell production. In terms of favorites, I started doing queen cells with the cell punch method because I use beeswax foundation, and that was the easiest before I learned how to graft. And I loved doing that and was able to make, dozens at a time. I do graft now, using a German hive tool and the JZBZ cups, and that's just kind of what I've gotten familiar with. In terms of starters, I use all the types of starters. So I set up a cloak board starter earlier this year. I then went to North Dakota for this research trial and it swarmed. So then it just became a queenless hive, but it's still working great as a starter. So sometimes I use a cloak board, sometimes I use a queenless hive, and then if I need to do it the same day, I'll use a swarm box. So I don't feel strongly about the type of starter that I use for the queen cells. All right, Dan, I have not pre-read this one, so we're going to go through it together. Can I add a medium honey super on top of 2 deep set? The second deep has 6 of the 10 frames drawn and filled. 4 frames are just the foundation and starting to draw out. The last 2 frames on either end, the middle frames have a combination of brood in the center and capped honey surrounding the brood.
So yeah, I mean, so I'm assuming the bottom box is totally full drawn, and your top box is 6 out of 10. They're working on 7 and 8. So yeah, I think absolutely. We're still kind of in the production part of the year. Bees are wanting to move up. I think Anna mentioned earlier, we're kind of past the peak wax making window, but bees still do make wax now, especially a colony that's just kind of growing into maturity. If there's a nectar flow, they will certainly make wax. So I would go ahead and add it. It's better to be a little early with it than a little late, and we're certainly not at the end of summer, early fall when I'm looking to kind of condense and consolidate things for the winter. So I would say, yeah, sounds like of your 2 box double deep, you're 75-80% full. I usually think, when you get into that range, give them more space when they fill up 2/3, 3/4 of what they got, and you're in the growth part of the year, give it to them.
All right, and I'm going to do a follow-up for you can comment or Anna too about, so people are asking about the oxalic dribble method. What do you think about doing the dribble method? And then also, oh, sorry, important notice from Michelle Armstrong that the Michigan Beekeepers Association is still selling tulip poplar potted young trees. So, go to mba.org, I think.
Bees.org.
Michigan Bees. Oh yeah, sorry. I know that website. I'm literally trying to show the video of figure out if I can share my screen just to show moth videos too. So I'm multitasking. But yeah, michiganbees.org to get potted tulip poplar trees. Oh, sorry. Before we go to oxalic acid, they were talking about for that hive that you just described, Dan, that it does only have foundation. And so if that's still okay.
Yeah, I that's fine. And worst case, they're not going to draw it, and you're going to take it off in a month, and they haven't touched it. But it's that's not really going to harm anything. It's better they have the opportunity and space to grow. If they don't choose to utilize it, not the end of the world. But better to give them the opportunity than risk them getting overly crowded and kind of honey bound down in their brood nest, and that can cause other sorts of problems. So I would definitely give it to them, even if it's just foundation. If they draw a couple frames of it, it's just that much of a head start on next year.
All right. So the questions are on like using the dribble and using, so like how we feel about the dribble method. And then also there's another question if we're still using the dribble and the sublimation/vaporization, or have we completely moved on to VarroxSan? I'll do a quick answer for me and then maybe everyone else can answer as well. So I like the VarroxSan in the summer because it's what you're supposed to use when it's labeled for when brood is in the hive. The rest of them are designed for broodless periods. So I like the dribble as an option for once the colony has gone broodless, like in November. I've never really used the vaporization because it's too much work for me. Dan, do you want to comment? And then Anna, if you have
Yeah, very
additional.
similar as far as I use the dribble as a, kind of winter cleanup, broodless, roughly around the 1st of December, give or take. I also have not really done the sublimation method. I've been happy with the results of the dribble, so I haven't gone away from that. And then similar VarroxSan, I view that, that's a summer treatment. There was a question about, well, I'll leave that one. I will say the one case where I've used the dribble in outside of that like winter cleanup period is when I have broodless colonies in the summer. Like if I've made either colonies have swarmed and they're in the midst of requeening, so they go without a laying queen for several weeks, or I've made like a walkaway split where I know the timing of that and I know, there's no capped brood in this colony for, this window of time, then an oxalic dribble can be a good effective treatment. I'm on the fence about going forward, whether I would continue to do that, or I would just put the VarroxSan strips in. But I do anticipate still using the oxalic dribble as a winter treatment. And say, started talking about earlier, I think the VarroxSan has its place in the summer management. I'm happy to be getting some firsthand experience with it this year. So that's how I, use the different methods.
Anna, anything to add?
You both covered it. Good job.
So there is a question about the Apivar 2.0. Do you have info on that at all? So is it different from the Amaflex? And then how does it play into the resistance issue?
I can't speak on it.
Yeah, and so some of these I am putting some notes. Some of these ones that are new, like they're so new that we haven't yet tried them. So we really can't talk about them yet. I really don't like to talk about stuff unless I know the published paper on it or it's based on my own experience. But for resistance, they all still are using the ones in that one that I just opened up, they are still using amatraz, so it would be the same active ingredient. So it would have to be something you're using. And Anna just put the information about the Apivar 2.0 in the chat. Another thing is there's a question about the shelf life of VarroxSan strips, and I would definitely, so they will have a use by date or a expired date on them, but that is a very good question for the manufacturer for sure. And they're very responsive as a company to questions, or that's been my experience. So if you have questions about like shelf life or things like that, do that. So we have a couple. Oh, there's a question that says, okay, Zachary, are you ready for one? They say, I have a laying worker hive and I merged them with a stronger hive, but they killed the queen and requeened the hive. Is that something that you commonly see?
Yes, that can happen. So I usually tell the beekeeper unless you're receiving colony is at least two or three, I would say to be safe, 3 times stronger than your laying worker colony, do not try to combine them because you risk losing the queen. So in this case, you probably combine the equal strength laying worker colony with the recipient colony. Then if it's 1-to-1, then definitely will lose the queen because the laying worker colony, a lot of bees are going to be aggressive toward the queen because a lot of them think they are the queen. The laying workers basically saying, I'm the queen, we don't want another queen. So they'll actively kill the other queens. So, but they get absorbed if that recipient colony is, say, 4 times bigger, then they don't have a chance. So you need to basically gauge the ratio of the two colonies before you make that decision to combine. Or safer ways to shake to break that laying worker colony, shake that into 4 or 5 different colonies in front of. So take 2 frames and shake into one, another 2 into another one. So you're basically dividing and conquering and dividing the anarchistic laying worker bees into 5 or 6 different colonies to reduce the chance of losing a queen. So that's what I would do. So don't do it unless it's very different. The recipient is much stronger. Also at least 3 times stronger. You might be okay. But there's safer ways to divide that. If you only have 2 colonies, then there's not much you can do. Some people just let them die off.
Oh, all right. My dog's barking at the back in the background. So, there's a question that I feel strongly about, so I'm going to take it, and then if other people want to weigh in, they can. So it says, should I treat for varroa mites preemptively or only after testing reveals mites? So I'm going to tell you my opinion and then a little, and kind of why it got to there. So right now, the main recommendation for varroa mite testing is using the alcohol wash. When that test was kind of developed and when they started to do the treatment thresholds, like integrated pest management, that was about 20 years ago now, and the treatment threshold used to be between 10 and 12%. So you would do an alcohol wash and wait until you saw 10 or 12% mites before you would treat. Which honestly, if you see 10 or 12% mites now, those bees would absolutely be dead. That was before a lot of the viruses were circulating at such high levels in the Varroa populations. Nowadays, the new Honeybee Health Coalition guides are talking about safe levels being at 1 or 2%. That test, especially when most humans use it, being humans, they're not great naturally at scooping bees. And a lot of times they underestimate, and it's not a very savvy test to get to 1 to 2%. So one of the issues of waiting until you get above the safe level is that the safe level is basically at the same place as the how well the test works. Like the alcohol wash could be off by 1 or 2%. So it's no longer being really useful as a tool to wait until you get much higher. Another issue with that test is a lot of that was based off of integrated pest management for how we deal with plant issues and isn't necessarily taking into account the ethics of dealing with animal diseases. And, we don't wait until an animal is very, very, very sick until we manage its health. Right now, we do know that most colonies, unless Varroa are managed, will die within 18 months if Varroa are just left unmanaged. So it can be treatment, like we mentioned, drone brood removal or splits or breaks in the brood cycle, or one of the acid-based treatment options or chemical treatment options. But you do have to be actively managing for mites kind of all season long. And now we're recommending using the alcohol wash as a way to make sure that your management is working. So we're using it not necessarily as a prescriptive diagnostic, but as I know I have mites in the hive and I need to be careful. One of the things that kind of pushed me towards that direction was when we did the VarroxSan field trial in 2023 and we did sticky board counts, and this was in hives that were completely healthy looking and that had overwintered and were totally fine. And we would have over 4,000 mites fall from that hive that in 1 week. And out of 2 hives, we had over 10,000 mites fall in a summer. So I think, we're in a place where the mite pressure is really high, probably thanks to Zachary, who's growing all these mites for his experiments as part of it. But we're in a very high pressure area. And so we do know that we have to manage mites. So I personally am no longer recommending that you wait until it gets high and try to knock it down, but that you are being active all season long, and then you're monitoring as part of that. Does anyone else want to comment on that? And you can disagree with me. I feel strongly about it, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, I used to teach beekeepers to check the mite levels before they waste the money to treat. And I was asking my student to track all my colonies 3 or 4 years ago, and he told me no mites. And then I even did it once late as September. He says very few mites, and I was trying to prepare them for winter, and my colonies were collapsing. So what happened? So I think there were mite bombs somewhere, and these just picked them up, and they just went up so fast. So then I decided there's probably no point counting mites. So actually, I went through that change, like Megan. So I said, there's no point tracking them because you will get the mites. So then might as well treat them 2 or 3 times a year, regardless.
And
Because tracking them is also expensive in terms of labor and time. So, but I haven't been growing mites yet this year. So if you have mites, high mite colonies, I can buy it from you.
yeah, I'm always looking for American foulbrood colonies, and Zachary's looking for mites, so we can maybe even like help solve your problems. Um, But yeah, and I think that is something that is very specific to this time period. Like when I moved to Michigan, I didn't have to treat at all, and it was glorious. And then it was like, oh, I have to do one thing, and I managed it just by making lots of nukes. And then it just got so much worse. I think we're at the point where it's worse, the worst now. I'm hoping that like all of this effort on breeding will be really positive, and that we'll be able to like there is a lot of really good steps forward with breeding and bee behaviors and things like that, and hopefully we'll start to see that effect coming in soon. But right now we're just kind of it's just kind of the worst
I
for
remember when I
Varroa.
studied at Michigan State 25 years ago, I was able to get away not treating bees if they started as packages, and that's not true anymore.
Yeah.
So 20 years ago, you can skip a year if you start with package bees, because I start low with mites. And I think I started with package bees 5 years ago. You'll still lose 50% if you don't treat during the winter. So and now it's probably going to be, I would say 70% if you don't treat at least once, even if you start with package bees. And they started with high mites already, so because mites have become resistant. So that's why when Megan asked me this year in February when this big bee die-off, that was my guesstimate. I should have put it on my blog and I'll be famous because I said, I'm betting the mites are resistant to amateurs because I saw so many mites in Georgia. I saw like 100 mites after painting 600 bees. That's like ridiculous. And those bees were being treated with some amateurs, gel stuff. So of course I can't even blog about it because those are called illegal treatments, and I don't want to expose my friend beekeeper who was helping my research. So, but that was my impression that bees mites are definitely resistant to amateurs, and that's probably why they're collapsing. So, but I don't have proof that I predicted. Other than Megan, telling Megan that.
I'll vouch for you, but I don't think there's any money for the in this prediction. Um, So on the mite new, I think we've got one more sad mite one, and then we've got I think just a couple more questions. It looks like most people are sticking around. So someone's asking if they have a colony that has a high mite load, would you use something other than VarroxSan to effectively lower the mite count before using VarroxSan, or would you use VarroxSan initially? So I will tell you what I have done, and then if other people want to chime in. So first off, we are doing some experiments, and again, we can do whatever we want because it's research, where we are combining formic acid and VarroxSan at the same time, or formic acid and oxalic acid at the same time, so that we kind of get a flash treatment and then the follow-up. The current label for formic acid does not allow it to be used when other things are in the same hive. So what you could do is use formic acid first and then follow up by VarroxSan. that would be what I would do, because the VarroxSan only works when things are out of things, being mites, are outside of the cappings. And the formic acid does work through the capping. So you can kind of do the formic acid in a colony that has lots of brood, get that to work, and then have the VarroxSan follow it up. And then that would, I think, help a little bit more, because the VarroxSan, the reason it's in there for so long is the bees do have to come into contact with it, and it has to kind of touch them as they come out. Dan, did you have something to follow up?
No, same idea. I would probably formic first, and then as I understand the oxalics, the VarroxSan is good at keeping low levels low, but it's not going to put out a. If you've got a major problem, you need something more fast acting. Like you said, you need. So no, I agree.
And we did, in our trial that we did in 2023, we had one hive that had 10% mites in the spring. And we did use VarroxSan and it did bring it down, but that is an N of 1. So as a scientist, I'm not going to be like, do this, we have the data, but it did work, at one time. So it might be, that's why I'm kind of optimistic about it. All right. So Dan, I'm going to have you help with this one on swarms. Our dear friend Lori in the UP, up there in the UP, wrote us a novel. So they had their first swarm in early June, and one hive had swarm cells, so they figured that was the one that swarmed. They waited for the new queen, and they wanted to do a hive check 10 days later, and it had already swarmed again. And then it swarmed again a week later, and they actually saw the secondary and tertiary swarms. And so what would you think was going on with this hive? Because they said that it's, the queen math is driving me crazy, because they were trying to stay out of the hive so that they didn't disrupt the queen that was coming back. But then they had these 2 other swarms that happened afterwards.
Yeah, so often colonies will issue these secondary, tertiary, and on swarms with virgin queens in them. They don't necessarily have to have a mated queen in a swarm. So I think that's probably what's happening here with this timing. When you have a hive that's getting ready to swarm, there can be a lot of queen cells that are all emerging around the same time. Queen goes with one. I mean, in theory, we read all the books and we say, well, all the virgins emerge and they either one virgin kills the others before they emerge, or they all emerge and battle each other until there's one left. But I think the reality of it is there can be multiple virgins and they're throwing off successive swarms. They may be waiting for the weather window to be right or something like that. But often I've occasionally seen colonies that will just swarm and swarm and swarm down to the size where there's like a grapefruit of bees left, and it's just, I don't know. That's but Megan, you may know more about the biology of it, or Zachary, but I think you're probably losing swarms, those secondary swarms and beyond, with virgins in them.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I would say the one thing that I would add is that the reason they continue to swarm is that the thing that urged them to swarm was never alleviated, which would be nectar in the brood nest. So in those contexts, it's totally fine not to go digging in there. But if I open a hive that has swarmed and I'm, missed my swarm management, I would definitely put supers on top of it and drawn comb on top of it, because the thing that triggers the swarming is the bees not having enough space to put nectar anywhere besides the brood nest. And then they will move it out of that brood nest if they have space to move it to. So you can keep the hive closed up, but I would make sure to put drawn comb on it if you had it before that. All right. One question is really quick. It says, does the dribble method in winter help with nosema? And I know no data that shows any association with oxalic acid and nosema, the microsporidial disease. So that's an easy question. And then the last one, it says, how many frames of honey should I have in, just as a person with 2 deep hives for over winter, how many frames should I have in each deep to help my bees survive the winter? So I'm going to take a stab at this and then other people can add to it. So the goal is to have whatever you're kind of overwintering in to be pretty much full of honey, and we're more concerned about weight. So in most parts of Michigan, it makes sense to have about 100 pounds of honey, more or less, to overwinter, and which would be 2 deeps. You could fill them up. So you want to make sure that there's food coming in at the time that the bees are reducing the size of the brood nest. So at a certain period, they're going to stop raising brood, and then they're going to have this whole open part where the brood nest used to be. And that at that point, we want them to backfill. So in the spring, backfilling is kind of the enemy, or summer, backfilling is the enemy. In the late fall, backfilling is the goal. And so depending where you are, like if you're in a place with a great secondary honey flow with goldenrods and the season, you maybe don't have to do a lot of feeding. But if you're in a place where you don't, have a lot of food, then you would be feeding at that period. So either you're feeding the bees to get up to weight, or Mother Nature is feeding the bees to get up to weight. So if you want to overwinter in 2 deeps, I would try to make them be basically pretty full. Like the whole thing should be full of food. Dan, did you want to add to that, or Zachary?
No, I would agree with that. And I just always work off the you can't fix starvation. That's a definitive endpoint. Better a little too much than not enough. And I find it much easier to feed in, September into early October than I do to try to get out there and feed in February and March if they're running short on it. So yeah, but I think like I said, fill up what you got, let them condense it in as their brood nest shrinks. And then I kind of sleep easier through the winter if I know, I got as much weight on them as I could.
All right, so that is the end of the questions. Thank you everyone for sticking around. I am going to show you my moth pictures that are coming in, and I'm going to go look at some moths, but I just want to show you how beautiful they are. And they're like almost as big as my hand. Wait, is that coming through?
Yeah.
So that's the Promethean silk moth. Isn't she
The male,
gorgeous?
female.
That one's a female. And then,
I
can you
heard
see the
if you put
video?
yeah. Oh,
Look, I'm
maybe.
gonna have babies next year. So the dark colored one on the right is the male. So I've got plans for the rest of the evening. I'm gonna go watch some moths. But
What
thank
do
you
they eat?
everyone
What's
for
the
the
host plant?
what's that?
What's the host plant?
They're on, that's the ones that are on the tulip poplar.
Oh, okay.
And there were 11. It looked like a Christmas tree over winter with all the little cocoons hanging from it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night, and we will see you in a month.